shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall hiss for the fly that is in the uttermost part of the rivers of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. And they shall come and shall rest all of them in the desolate valleys, and in the holes of the rocks, and upon all thorns, and upon all bushes. In the same day shall the Lord shave with the razor that is hired, namely by them beyond the river, by the king of Assyria.
Hello, good morning. Welcome to Line by Line Bible Study. I'm a little trouble with my internet connection this morning, so we're starting a little late. We're continuing the book of Isaiah, chapter 7, verse 18. I believe it was 18, I said. Yeah. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall hiss for the fly that is in the uttermost part of the rivers of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. And they shall come and shall rest all of them in the desolate valleys, and in the holes of the rocks, and upon all thorns, and upon all bushes. In the same day shall the Lord shave with a razor that is hired, namely by them beyond the river, by the king of Assyria, the head and the hair of the feet, and it shall also consume the beard. Alright, hold on. There's a series of it shall come to pass in that day is here. And what day are we talking about? Well, the day when the Lord brought upon them the days that had not been. It was the king of Assyria. Nothing like that had ever come upon Israel, like such an invasion. They'd been oppressed by their neighbors and also ruled over their neighbors, as the time may be. So Israel, a time dominated its neighbor, and its time was dominated, like the Philistines, the Midianites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the region around them. There was, during the reign of David, they were the dominant power. But after Solomon and the kings that followed, the power began to wane, and eventually the Assyrians rose in the northwest, or northeast, sorry. And then that resulted in their being carried away into captivity and being, oppressed in a way they'd never been before, as far as like having all their cities laid siege to and taken. And, other cases they'd had some battles and stuff and won and lost and been under tribute and taken tribute and that kind of thing. This is a very different kind of thing. The Assyrians were very cruel in their, making all the other enemies look kind of, let's say less odorous by comparison. Onerous is the word I want. And what I also want is, camera. All right, so what is this about the bee? So, those are the days that we're talking about. And obviously, like I've talked about the whole time, you can compare prophecy in the Old Testament, prophecy in the New Testament. There's a lot of similarity. And you can apply the lessons learned from old prophecy to new prophecy to your daily life. There's so much that can be applied from the prophets and from the lessons of the prophets. Because the same dynamics that govern human affairs 2,000 years ago still apply today in many, many ways. Human dynamics as far as the human interaction and the way we, and the predictability of human behavior. Sorry, I'm sniffing so much. Just this last year with the coronavirus, I thought it was very eye-opening as far as like, when I think about the mark of the beast and I look at the masks and then the vaccine passport. Not that I think we need anything electronic, but I see how badly they want to do something like the mark of the beast. And also, I see two things. One, how willing people are. People, when I was growing up, they used to say, oh, you'll need to have the 666 and it'll be a microchip, and they need technology. The technology is coming, they used to say, for the mark of the beast. I was always skeptical of that because I don't think you need any technology for the mark of the beast. Because it's very simple. All it needs is social enforcement. You don't have to have anything except social enforcement. If you look at the dynamic of Revelation with the whole world worshiping Satan. Like, nobody worshipped Anthony Fauci. They may have fawned over him a bit. Nobody worshipped him. But boy, they did whatever he said. And so you can imagine a world in which we have an Antichrist who is either human or somewhat supernatural figure or an in-between hybrid type thing. And this person is completely wowing the world with miracles. And everyone says he's God. And if you don't, you will find it very difficult to buy and sell. And it doesn't have to be anything except it could be literally a tattoo. Though I don't think it's going to be a tattoo of the number 666, which would be a little too obvious. But then on the other hand, you'd be shocked what people will do when they're of a mind, when they're deluded to, as much as they know. So I don't know. But this analogy of the bee and the fly, he will hiss for the fly. That means to hiss. And I have to depend on what I've been told for this, as far as my understanding that I received from others, my instruction. But I was told that this hissing refers to the way that people will actually call for certain kinds of insects. Is that right? I don't know. But the idea is that he will hiss for the fly in Egypt. I would think it's more of a predatory fly for some reason, just because the bee has a stinger. Some flies bite. Flies in Egypt aren't necessarily house flies of America. So there was a plague of flies, even, right? So I think that was just fly could refer to any flying insect in that regard. And it could mean all kinds of flying insects. But the point is, the Lord's going to call to the fly that is in the uttermost parts of the rivers of Egypt. In the littlest thing, in the bee. Now, they are little, but the real thing about flies and bees is they come in swarms, right? A swarm of bees, a swarm of flies. Flies are a nuisance animal, right? But when there's a lot of them, you ever see a lot of flies or a lot of bees? Much like locusts, an individual is not particularly a big. One fly is just a small nuisance. But of course, 100 flies in your house can drive you insane, literally. I'll sit here and have flies land on me while I'm trying to work, and it starts to make my mind go a bit loopy. It can just drive you nuts. It's just like anything with, they keep landing on you. It's infuriating. Bees, again, one stings you, it can hurt, sure. But they are, in a cluster, it can be very overwhelming and certainly terrifying to be attacked by a bunch of bees. Have you ever seen someone attacked by bees? They don't look like they're amused. So the Assyrians are sort of likened to bees, the Egyptians to flies, which is for their relative threat. It's interesting because they look to Egypt for help, actually, in this history. So it's interesting the Lord sends them here. And I don't know if they're thought of as, why are the Egyptians flies and the Assyrians bees? It could have something to do with the at this point in history, the relative opinion of each, because the Assyrians were a rising, strong power, industrious, and Egypt was kind of a stale, old thing, and they were trying to rely on the Egyptians for help, but they were not to be relied upon. And like flies, the best they can do is annoy you. They don't serve much of a purpose, at least maybe except to feed sparrows, I suppose. Sparrows don't. I don't know if sparrows will eat anything. What am I talking about? But actually, they eat a lot of mosquitoes. That's what the Chinese found out after they tried to exterminate sparrows. They had a plague of insects because the sparrows were a major factor in killing them. Follow the science, people. You know what following the science is? You learn a little something and you do something stupid with it. That's follow science, again, is the most goofy thing anyone could ever say, because science has no guidance for you. None. You need moral guidance, and science doesn't have it. Because even if every time I hear someone try to make science into some kind of moral thing, they always start talking about good and things that are good and relative. You have to decide on a moral basis that good and evil matter, that human good is a goal, and science doesn't have anything for that. Anybody who says otherwise is just making it up and doesn't understand the question. And they shall come and shall rest all of them in the desolate valleys. He's talking about the armies coming to Israel. Egypt does eventually come, but not helpful. But they will come. And they will rest in all the desolate valleys and the holes of the rocks. Just like insects, you ever see when a lot of bugs invade an area? They're just on everything. If you've ever seen an invasion of locusts or flies, I mean, you can get flies. We get ladybugs. In certain places, I'll get a lot of flies. But, it can be plague level, obviously. And that's what he's talking about here. It's like he would summon them like a plague. And then they would occupy the land in that day. And the same day, God would shave with a razor that is hired. Well, here's the important. This is not obvious, and you'd have to know this from history. The razor that is hired is the king of Assyria. They say that clearly in this sentence. But why is he the razor that is hired? Well, because Israel and Judah tried to hire the king of Assyria. Well, Judah tried to hire the king of Assyria to fight against the king of Israel for them. Hire a bigger bully to take care of the bullies, which is, of course, a bad idea if the bigger bully turns on you after he takes care of the little bully. And that's kind of what happened with Assyria, is by bringing them to their defense, they also invited them into the region and made them start thinking about designs on the Holy Land there. So shave with a razor. So the next analogy is they're like a razor that shaves. And so razors take off hairs, right? And that's obvious. A hair remover. And he's gonna shave the head and the hair of the feet and the beard, which is a significant thing. You'd think the beard would be the least important of all, right? Now, who shares their legs? Or the hair of the head? Some people do. But the point is, it wasn't exactly a style choice at this point. And especially the beard. Now, the beard, it's kind of in style again, which is precisely why I don't wear one. Just because I like to avoid style, actually. Well, it's just a stupid instinct on my part to do the opposite of what everyone else is doing. It's not entirely a stupid instinct, but it could bite you, Everyone's getting off the ship and you try to find some other way, But maybe you find the lifeboat that's, whatever, Sometimes not jamming in with the crowd is a really good idea, and I've always tried to follow that, though it's not always the best move, right? So a razor obviously is a thing that cuts hair, and the hair is the people of Israel. Remember I talked about the Israel and likened it to a sick person from the sole of the foot even to the head. There is no soundness in it, but wounds and bruises and putrefying sores. And he's likening the whole state of Israel to like the body politic, so to speak. There is a person, Israel. And the people are like the hairs. And the Assyrian is like a razor coming along and shaving all the hairs off the head, all the hairs off the feet, and all the ears off the beard. Having your beard shaved to an Israelite at this time was a very shameful thing. Men without beards were felt, like naked, and having it, it was like one time I forgot exactly the incident, but like if you wanted to insult, like there was an incident where they sent some messengers, and the messengers were treated badly, and they had their beards cut off, and they were sent into hiding till their beards could grow back. I forgot about which king, and David, Solomon, or one of the later ones. Anyways, so cutting off people's beards and stripping their clothes off was considered a really good way to insult someone or to shame them or to humiliate them. And so this passage is talking about total humiliation. Women don't want their hair cut. Shaving a woman's head is a form of humiliation. You can prove it. Well, not prove, but this can be seen at the end of World War II. There are many examples, like in France, of young women who were sleeping with the Nazis, or anyone who was collaborating. When the Nazis finally lost, the women who slept with Nazis were, there's at least in the movies anyways, they show them in the street, and the people are shaving off their hair and putting Nazi sympathizer or whatever around their neck or whatever. Pretty, not the harshest punishment. Harsh, socially cruel, but, it's not the worst thing people could do to you, at least in that context. I mean, you've been collaborating with the Nazis, and all they do is shave your hair and kind of humiliate you. It's like, you can move to, it is a major humiliation, but you got to understand, you've been sympathizing with the enemies. And even though young girls are sometimes foolish and stupid and getting themselves into these things, the consequences, we all have to live often with the consequences of our actions, even when we don't like what those consequences are. So it's talking about shaming, shave the head. The feet part I don't get. I don't know why the feet are there. I think it's just saying, the thing is, I don't think anybody ever shaves their feet, but head and beard, there are reasons you might shave your head or beard. In fact, there were certain vows in which you would shave your hair. Like clean, I think the Nazarite, you start with a shaven head. I know Paul shaved his head at some point, the Apostle Paul. So there are reasons you would shave your head. There are reasons you would shave your beard even. And it might be embarrassing to that culture, but it's different if you have to do it for some purpose than if you were done it, the enemy has shaved my beard, and it's humiliating. All right, whatever. But the feet, nobody shaves the feet. And the reason I think it's thrown in, and I could be wrong, but my thinking is it's thrown in because it is a weird, utter area. Because the whole point is it's going to come from the uttermost parts of the rivers of Egypt. And from all the, in the land of Assyria, which to them is a mysterious, far-off place. And so the idea is that the hair of the feet represents the little places you wouldn't expect the razor to go. Very thorough. It's even to shave your feet. If you go to the barber, you might expect to get a shave and a haircut, right? But would you expect to have your feet shaved and your legs maybe even, but your feet? Does anyone even try to shave feet? I actually have no hair on my feet because I wear socks 365 days a year. There's a fact you didn't need to know, but now you know it and you can't stop. And it shall come to pass in that day. Okay, so that's about all that's about. It shall come to pass that a man shall nourish a young cow, and 2 sheep. And it shall come to pass, for the abundance of milk that they shall give, that he shall eat butter. For butter and honey shall everyone eat that is left in the land. And so, that's what I was talking about before, is that when the land is depopulated, it's going to be so few people that people just live off the fat of the land. Because, imagine you have all these productive farms, all these productive agricultural things, and someone just comes through and sweeps everything up. But the thing is, when they come through and sweep everything up, there's no way they're going to do a thorough job of totally taking everything. So there's a lot of leftover spoils, and especially in livestock that escapes, food that's laying around, unkept bee. Nobody's going out and gathering the honey. There's not as much demand for honey, so there's all the demand. It's a collapse of demand, where all of a sudden nobody wants anything because nobody's there, or there's a lot less people. And everyone's subsisting on butter and honey. Why eat anything else? I talked about the other day. They will eat butter and honey, everyone that's left. But it also speaks to the after the tribulation period in the book of Revelation, and as we saw in chapter 2 of Isaiah, that after is ushered in a golden age. Where the land of Israel was known as the land of milk and honey. When the Jews were promised the promised land, it was a land of milk and honey, a land flowing with milk and honey. And it's sort of it speaks to a restoration. It's like, the land I gave you, I'm taking away, and I'm restoring it to its status of a land of milk and honey, and people who are left there will enjoy it as such. The remnant will still enjoy my beautiful land. The land I brought them into. The land isn't so beautiful anymore, and people look at it. You understand that it's changed because of human occupation and abuse. One of the things the Israelites did while they were there is they never gave the land rest. I look at like my farmers out here, they plant. I've been here for 20 years, and after the first year, they've never planted anything except corn. And there's no year where the land gets any rest or any change. They just fertilize the crap out of it. The soil is not black; it's brown. It's starting to get a lighter brown. It looks like clay to me almost. It's so denatured and so stripped of all nutrients. I marvel. I wonder what it's going to look like in 100 years, of whether my house will be in the middle of a desert, or at least whether or not, here's the thing: as long as there's population that needs to be sustained, they will make crops. They will plant corn. But if when demand collapses, that's different. Okay. And it shall come to pass in that day that every place shall be, where there were 1,000 vines and 1,000 silverlings, it shall even be for briars and thorns. I'm not sure what that means, and I'm not sure what silverlings meant. I'm not going to look at my old Bible because that's annoying. I'm going to look it up here. I mean, just annoying. I just think it's I don't like staring down at my Bible when I'm supposed to be doing a Bible study. The never-ending cascade of windows. There were 1,000 vines and 1,000 silverlings. Silverlings. Okay, it's just silver money. 1,000 pieces of silver, whatever. Now, I don't know. Here's how here's a cool thing. I'm going to teach about, I like to teach you how to study. That's one of the things I primarily like. I don't primarily do, but in my mind I want to do it. I want to teach people how to think. And we look at this, okay, it just means silverlings. And so we don't know, and here's the thing, is you may just jump to the conclusion of what it means. And that's fine. But it's good to analyze how we arrive at our conclusions, because the way we arrive at our conclusions could be the source of an error. We could start off okay, but then somewhere in the middle we get messed up and we end up at a conclusion that's wrong. And so it's not hard to understand what it means. For example, 1,000 vines and 1,000 silverlings. My first question is, what is the value of that? What is a silverling worth? Or a lot of times when you get weights and measures also. We had a similar passage where it talked about, I think it was weights, no, I can't remember what the passage was. But, there are weights and measures. You'll get weights and measures passages. Oh, yeah. It says, the seed of an homer shall yield a bath. And you're like, what's that all mean? But from the context, that when it says the seed of an homer shall yield an ephah, and you read the context of that chapter we were studying earlier in Isaiah, it's obvious that it's referring to some sort of scarcity. That it's saying it's not going to produce very much. Now, 10 acres of vineyard yielding one bath may not be obvious to everyone, but I know what 10 acres looks like, and thinking about only a bath, whatever that size that is, well, shall yield a bath, and a homer an ephah. It's obvious that we're talking about big things going to small things. And obviously, a big vineyard is going to yield less wine than the actual size of the vineyard. But from the context, since it's supposed to be, a declaration of something that is undesirable, it must mean that's too small. And here, the 1,000 vines at 1,000 silverlings, to me that means each vine is worth a piece of silver, which is probably a lot. Because I assume things like, if sparrows go for, 2 sparrows are sold for a farthing, so to speak, in biblical language. That's in King James speak. I don't know what, a shekel in Hebrew or whatever the smallest denomination. You get 2 for the price of the smallest thing. And so plants, how much higher do they rank? Here's a vine we've got rooted. A rooted vine. They cost $6 or $7 at Farm and Fleet. How much are they going to cost? So a piece of silver, that might be the equivalent of $100. So this 1,000 vines at 1,000 silverlings, well, it shall even be for briars and thorns. So this valuable vineyard is now going to be for briars and thorns. Obviously, the context means that 1,000 silverlings is a significantly valuable amount of money because of the context. It's not, you could have figured that out, of course. But what I'm saying is you can apply the same principle when you're studying the scriptures. Use logic and look at the context carefully. And of course, don't be afraid to look up the meaning of words. Don't get too cute with it, because sometimes we can look up the meaning of words and try to manipulate the scripture into something we want it to say. Or, oftentimes I used to look at passages that were really obscure sounding, like I didn't understand what it said, and I would try to retranslate the words in such a way that it would say something else that made more sense to me. But that's not a particularly good approach either. If you don't like the way something's translated, you're better off comparing it to another translation. Because no matter how much you like no matter how much you might dislike the NIV translation, and some people hate it, and as I jokingly call it, the devil's translation. Even as much as you don't like it, the people who translate it know a lot more about Hebrew than you or I do. Okay, and so though they may have made some decisions that on an intellectual level, like if we were just talking and they discussed their decision with me, I might not agree with their decision of the translation, like what they did. And that might be on a level that I could argue with a person, as far as like I could argue about their choice if it comes down to a choice. But as regards to the language, I have nothing to say. If they say, well, this word could mean this or that, then we could have like a discussion about why contextually it makes sense. Because on some level, I can enter into a discussion with someone who knows a lot more than I do if I'm sufficiently, on the right grounds. Meaning if an expert gives you enough information, it's no longer their job to make the decision. That's what I meant about Dr. Fauci all the past year. Everyone was all just doing whatever the doctor says. And when I go to the doctor, he makes recommendations. He gives me prescriptions. I don't have to take or do anything he says. I remember my dentist told me I needed to have my wisdom teeth removed. I never saw that dentist again. Nobody tells me what I have to do. And they keep pestering me. I'll find a new dentist. That's what I do. It's like, I don't want my wisdom teeth removed. They came in fine. They were wrong. I didn't even make my teeth crooked. I still got my teeth straight. Didn't change anything. Maybe a tiny bit. There are movie stars with more crooked teeth than mine. I mean, seriously, who cares? It's just so, But the point is, what's the point? Oh, we can have understanding without being an expert. Doctors make recommendations, but we have to make a moral decision. Is this what's right for me? Do I want to take the doctor can't tell you, are you comfortable with the risk of this procedure? That's a question you have to answer. Are you comfortable with the risk or the invasiveness of this procedure? Are you comfortable with this and that? And that's how medical stuff goes. Your body, your choice. In this country, we have something called Roe versus Wade. And it was a landmark decision that decided that a woman's body privacy extended to the ability to kill her unborn child in the womb. So if that doesn't extend to my ability to control what doctors say I got to do with my body, I don't know what does. You know what I mean? If I don't have some protection based on that, like to refuse medical procedures or to decide to get medical procedures, that's my choice. It's the one bright thing about Roe versus Wade. You want to look on the bright side? There it is. Medical autonomy. No one can tell you what you can or can't do within, reason. I mean, within even going beyond reason into murder, okay? They can't tell you what you can do with your body. And I think it's the whole idea of forcing people to get vaccines is going to die on that rock in America anyways. It's not enough. It's not a big enough crisis. When I talked about the mark of the beast, there are ways in which people get the mark of the beast. And people thought it was technology. That if they have the technology and they push hard enough, no, it's a crisis. All they need is the right crisis and to be ready. The masks just fell out of heaven for them. And you saw a mark of the beast-like effect. I did, where I went to certain stores and literally was thrown out, couldn't buy. Now, that never happened to me because my brother was thrown out of a place, or at least one, and my wife was thrown out. And I've been yelled at. That's happened. And there are some stores where they won't check you out if you're not wearing a mask. That was, there's one place, that's where, Menards. I don't wear a mask in Menards, but I do when I check out. I pull it on because I don't want to deal with their stupidity, with their whatever. It's fine. It's the only place in the store where it almost makes sense. It's so big. If I hadn't had the virus in October, I would say it almost makes sense. It does make a bit of sense. But even so, the ceiling is about 100 feet above me, and it's one of the most open air stores in the world. And if you get a respiratory disease at Menards, that's a pretty good trick, because the air there is very fresh, very open air. Because the way you get virus, you get in a small area where the concentration of the virus is higher, you're more likely to pick it up. People get sick at home. They should have everyone stay at work and say, don't go home. That would have slowed the spread. Anyways, we're getting off the track. You don't have to do what people say. Anyways, that's not the subject. In Israel, wherever there was rich, fertile vineyard, there will be briars and thorns. It's going to be taken over by weeds. The meaning of that is obvious. It's going to go to the seed. It's going to go, well, not to seed, it's going to go to the wild. And that it doesn't take long. I've been living in the country for 20 years. And it's fun to have a couple acres of land and areas that are kind of wild and to get to observe nature a little more firsthand than I did when I lived in the suburbs. So the suburbs are pretty, a lot more things growing. We had gardens and stuff growing up. My mom planted stuff, and so it wasn't but I wasn't that involved with it. So as an adult though, when my first place I lived, the first two places I lived as an adult were both apartments, one at college and one with my wife, and they both were in concrete jungles. So a lot of people don't live where plants are common, and when you don't continue to cultivate stuff, it immediately takes over. It doesn't take long for weeds to absolutely destroy. It's interesting the cycles they get through. I had a little plot of land I just let go fallow for several years, and it was fascinating because at the end of like 3 or 4 years, it was all grass and some trees. It was all grass and some trees. The grass eventually choked everything else out, which fascinated me. I didn't realize how aggressive grass was, because it is quite aggressive, and it chokes out so many other. If you let it grow, if you let grass grow, it will choke dandelions. Dandelions can't grow in the grass; they only can grow on lawns. In the grass, they struggle. They get all long, and you've probably seen them in the grass. They get spindly. They get choked out so badly. Everything gets choked out except maybe trees. It was interesting, and so. Whatever. Israel, as the land is depopulated, it's going to be refilled with people who are, well, it's going to be empty for a while. And things are going to go to, but in a spiritual sense, obviously it's speaking also to Israel is left, all the people have been taken away. And remember, he talked about it was his vine, Israel, his vine. And now Israel also has their own vines, their own works, their own lives that they invested everything in and that was valuable to them, and it's just going to be taken over by the wild. With arrows and with bows shall men come thither, because all the land shall become briars and thorns. Men will go forth with arrows and bows. Why? Well, on all hills that shall be digged with the mattock, or that should be digged, there shall not come thither the fear of briars and thorns, but it shall be for the sending forth of oxen and the treading of lesser cattle. I read that terribly, but that's a really odd verse. And I'm curious to see what other translations say about that one, because I know a translation based on the notes in my old Bible. And what they said is, first of all, I want to look at mattock, because I don't know what a mattock is. And according to Strong's, it's a hoe. That's what I assumed it was. Like a wooden hoe for some reason, a mattock. So the briars and thorns come out every place where there should have been thorn, and people are going to go forth with arrows and bows for fear of briars and thorns. This doesn't sound very millennial, but maybe it is. Here's the thing. Maybe it is. And I'll tell you why. Because the millennium, much like the time after the Assyrian captivity, the millennium will take place and start off in a world that has been significantly depopulated. We're going to have a population collapse when Jesus returns. As far as human population is going to be, through the course of the tribulation, is going to be reduced by at least a third, which is a horrific amount of dead bodies. I mean, horrific. I mean, not even, like, the world has never seen so much death at once. Well, no, it has seen death like this. Okay, the earth has seen. But our world, the world of men has never seen that much death that I know of. Even the Black Death, I think, was not, or was it significant? I remember was it a quarter of the population? It wasn't half, was it? No, I don't think it was quite that, but it was quite significant. Maybe it was a third. In the Black Death, many died. And it was pretty horrendous as far as the burying and all that. But here's the thing. Even as a percentage, there's just a lot more people now. There's a lot more places that are filled with people now. And the cities are bigger and stuff. I mean, so when you have a quarter of a city die, or something like that, that's I mean, you want to talk about plagues, man. Coronavirus is nothing. I mean, it has to be acknowledged, it was not a significantly, I mean, like, the statistics, last year, it was not a particularly big death year in America, from what I hear. And I'd like to be corrected on that if that's not right, and I got to look into that to make sure of those facts. But it was not. Meaning no more people than average died. Meaning a lot of the people who died from coronavirus were on their way out anyways. But we've known this for months. Okay. But the world is going to be depopulated, and so there's going to be a wild world. And so the briars and thorns, I think, just refers to the wild. I'm waving a ruler around. Sorry if it's being distracting. The part about briars and thorns, it's like it is a stereotypical plant that refers to an uncultivated and wild place. That the most undesirable and aggressive plants take over. When you leave a place alone, first thing that I got all kinds of areas in my property where it's like I look and I see just 10 or 20 thistles just trying to get started right now in May. Or it's still April. I can see them putting out their big fat leaves, just getting ready to dump those thistles on my poor dogs. I want to get rid of them. But it is a stereotypical plant that says you are in an uncultivated, unmanaged, and undesirable. The land is in that state, in an undesirable, uncultivated, and wild state. And of course, with the wild state of the land comes the wild state of animals, and also the wild state of men, which provides an interesting contrast that I don't know that the literal meaning of this has any bearing on the millennium. But, once you live by the sword, you die by the sword. You can't just dismiss it. I can't just say this part has nothing to do with it. I have to try a little. And the reason is because if I don't look at this a little bit millennially, or try to at least, then how can I say any part of it refers to it? If it's at the end, and then it's nothing, and then it has, and the thing is, it's not like there's no precedent for that. You understand, there is precedent in the scripture for a prophecy just existing as part of a passage. Zechariah 9:9 and Zechariah 9:10 are a good example. I mention them very often. But in one verse, and I learned this from my original teacher, in one verse you have a passage that clearly sounds like the first advent, that the Messiah was coming lowly and riding on an ass. And in the next verse, he's breaking and having battle. He's breaking the horse and the chariot, and he's having a battle with the enemy. And it's obviously talking about events that we associate with the second advent. So you can have in the middle of a prophecy break off and talk about things that have nothing to do with what you were just talking about. Meaning it may have bearing on Isaiah's time historically, but it may have no bearing on the millennium. But I will at least try, because I do not want to assume a passage has no bearing until it's been shown to me somewhat definitively that it has no bearing. So, while I understand clearly what this means in context of the Assyrian captivity, when the land goes wild, it's not cultivated, there aren't as many people, so there is more danger. Men will go out with arrows and bows. One, potentially, I don't think it's for defense, because if they were talking about defense, and that's the thing, is I wonder about that. I'm assuming it's for defense, and I have for years. But maybe it's for hunting. Or maybe it's for defending, because it says they're going to send forth cattle, lesser cattle, which means small cattle, because they're not going to have big herds anymore. And a lot of the big animals are going to be taken. Meaning the best animals are going to be taken. The ones that the Assyrians will tend to leave behind are going to be the lesser. Meaning the weak-looking cattle. If you forget one, don't forget to take that big one. But the other one might get left behind. It looks scrawny and sick. And it might just mean small animals also. I didn't check that word cattle. But the bows and arrows may refer to hunting. Men will come, or hunting in the sense of protecting the flocks, like David did with his sling. Now that makes sense, because I know David protected his flock with a sling and a stone from lions and bears. So a ranged weapon, not for your own protection against humans, because against a human, I don't think, though a ranged weapon might be effective at killing someone, it's going to be in a certain situation. Like if I'm in the wild and I'm ambushed, a sling and a stone or a bow and arrow are not my best helper. Because if you're going to be ambushed in the wilderness or in a lonely place, you're not going to see it coming. And so a sling and a stone, while a good for, like you're watching cattle and you see a wolf and you want to shoot at it, makes sense. You don't have to get close to the wolf. Also, you don't have to run over where the cattle, there's time. So maybe shooting at them makes sense. David certainly did. And so I know that's something people did. I know they use slings and stones. And they use bows and arrows, probably it's a ranged weapon. So that makes a lot of sense. But if you were traveling, would you bring a bow and arrow as a defense. That doesn't sound right to me. Bow and arrow is a hunting thing, or to defend or to drive off animals. So that's what that, David defended against the lion with a sling and a stone, not with a knife in his bare hands. He was going to use a stone and pepper it with stones to keep his distance. And that makes sense if you're going to talk about wolves and bears and lions. Okay. But humans, I would, if you want something to defend yourself against a human attack as you're traveling, a shield is obviously the best thing, and maybe a short sword or something. But your main thing is some sort of thing to give yourself time to react. Like if if you were in a knife fight, what's the first thing in the movies? They always wrap their hand in some sort of cloth, and the other guy gives them a moment to do that so that it's fair. But they protect their hands. And so a shield provides protection and can be quickly brought to bear against an enemy who is giving you a surprise attack. It may be the only thing you want in your hand because you're trying to deflect a killing blow. And in fact, there are passages in the Bible where it talks about a man with a shield, and it's presented as a man who is well defended and strong. So that's my own 2 cents on that. I do think that that's a pretty good assessment of the biblical, what would I call it? The overview of weapons and arms in this context. Like I said, a slingshot or a bow and arrow is not a defensive weapon. And I think in the past I looked at it like this, which I think that's not quite right. So these hills should have been farmed. They should have been digged with the hoe, but instead, there shall not come thither the fear of briar and thorns. That is a weird sentence. Like the fear won't come out? Why isn't the fear not coming to the hills? Well, obviously, what it's saying, is the idea that people would not come thither for fear of briars and thorns. And for fear, not of briars and thorns, but for what may be. The briars and thorns are put as a figure of speech for what is hiding in them, which is like the wild animals and stuff. So people go out armed with slings and stones and bows and arrows to drive off animals that may attack them. They don't want to go in. They're afraid of the thicket because of what might be hiding there. So the hills that should have been hoed and digged, they would not come out for fear of the briars and thorns and what was hiding inside. But instead they would send forth oxen and lesser cattle, which would then make sense because to defend the flocks you would have a bow and arrow maybe or a sling and a stone. And that's an appropriate weapon for a shepherd of some sorts. And we know this from David. As I'm saying, you can learn things. You don't have to have an expert tell you if you just use logic and become familiar with the scriptures. At least it gives me some kind of insight. Now I'm just curious because I said so. What's the Devil's Translation have to say about this? Because this is not one of those places that, I don't think that. Like I said, the King James is my favorite translation, but I am not a King James only person. All right, I hope that's clear. I like the King James. I think it's a beautiful translation for the most part, but sometimes it really lets us down. And because they didn't know as much about Hebrew as scholars do today. And you'd think that's counterintuitive. Like in the old days, they probably understood it better. Well, no, because it was already a dead language at that point. And they relied a lot on the Latin Vulgate to help them understand what it meant. So any translation errors in the Vulgate were actually compounded sometimes because you're translating from a language into a language. This is sometimes the nonsense you'll hear people say where it's a translation of a translation. And that's the Old Testament in the King James because they relied, I think, on the Vulgate. I could be wrong. I apologize if I am. But the Vulgate. Oh. Anyways, they've learned a lot more about translation due to found documents. There have been additional archaeological finds that have helped our understanding. The Dead Sea Scrolls also help because they have copies of the Old Testament that predate the ones we used to have. But anyways, sometimes the King James translators just didn't get it right. They just didn't get it right, and it's not a perfect translation. And if you think so, you got the wrong idea. It's wrong. There are mistakes. It's many, not enough to and some of them are quite bad. But here it says, "As for all the hills once cultivated by the hoe, you will no longer go there for fear of briars and thorns. They will become places where cattle are turned loose and where sheep run." Yeah, so again, you notice how the difference here, they add these little words. Because if you read the Hebrew, the language is much more like the King James, meaning there's a lot of ambiguity because it's prophetic. But what they do is they turn it into this almost narrative way of writing it. And so it just loses all that stark sense of that very cut, like that fresh cut out of the stone feeling. Like you just cut the Ten Commandments right out of the stone carved by God. "Thus saith the Lord," But it says, "This is what the Lord says." It just loses any gravity. "As for all the hills once cultivated by the hoe, you will no longer go there for fear of briars and thorns." That's not actually a terrible rewording of it. And the NIV is by no means the worst translation. I just say it's the devil's translation just to tease. But I'm not going to compare with. I think this is fine. That's what I was saying. It's like it's the fear of briars and thorns that's keeping people away. And it may seem like we spent too much time on it. Maybe we did. We should go on to the next chat. We got 10 minutes, maybe, or we got 5. 8. No, we got 9.5. So main thing is that the Assyrian would be brought in. It would devastate the land. People would be, and what about just the last thing? What about millennial implications? What could that possibly mean? And like I said, the world will also be depopulated. But the thing is, it says in God's kingdom, though, when he comes, and it said it in Isaiah 2, that, and it's interesting because he was talking about, and here's the thing, those people who are pure preterists, is that praetor, or everything means past. Like all the prophecies are past, they're things that happened in the past, it's all history. How can Isaiah 2, which says, the child should put their hand... obviously they're not talking about... They don't specifically mention animals, right? But it says, "They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain. That the child will put his hole on the asp and not be stung. That the lion shall lie with the lamb," right? All this very clear picture of total peace and tranquility is drawn. But then we have this other image of after the Assyrian invades, that says it's going to be like this devastated land. People are going to be going out with bows and arrows because they'll be so afraid. It's a long way from "they shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain," isn't it? So the question is, how do you apply this? Well, like maybe it's separated, but like I said, you have this passage, and then you have chapter 2. Isaiah talking about essentially the same historic event, the Assyrian invasion. But on one hand, he's got a much wider eye fixed in on the end and on the kingdom of God that is coming than he does on the events of his day. Whereas this one, he's really focused on his day. And even in the days to come, after the Assyrian invades, he's looking very much at his time. And it becomes very hard to draw any kind of analogy to God's kingdom, unless one were to say, well, the world is going to be a lot less cultivated. It is going to be a lot less worked by men. It is going to be a lot more wild. Things are going to return to nature to a great degree in the time of Jesus. Because there's just going to be less people. There's going to be areas and homes and things that are taken over by in cities, no doubt, just taken over, because there's going to be one, at the end of the tribulation, there's going to be such an earthquake that the cities and the nations will fall. Like, so the cities that people are currently inhabiting are going to be ruins in the time of Christ. No one will, I don't think anyone's going to live there. I mean, they might live there, but the point is it's not going to be like just this. I mean, it'll be someplace that maybe needs to be cleaned up, and there'll be 1,000 years to do that. But there will be some sort of world thing. And it also depends on how literally you take that lion lying with the lamb thing. If that's just a poetic saying way of peace of a poetic way of saying that there's going to be utter peace in the land, and that normally warring factions are going to be at peace, and there'll be no one's going to hurt anybody. If it's just not actually changing about a change in the state of nature, but actually more of a how nature feels to man. I mean, you could say in my house, it's like the lion lies with the lamb, and the wolf lies with the actually the lion lies with the calf, and the wolf lies with the lamb, because that's actually what it says. And you could say all that of my home, because we have peace. And wherever there is peace, you could say the lion is lying with the lamb, or the lion is lying with the calf, whatever. Or they've beaten their swords into plowshares. I beat my sword into a ruler, whatever. You could say that when you're at peace, like, because it's just a metaphor for peace. You're beating your swords into plowshares. It's not like we got to actually, like, do you think there's going to be literally a line where people are lining up to beat swords into plowshares just for fun? Like Build-A-Bear Workshop or something in the kingdom of God. Let's go to the mall in the kingdom of God, and let's go beat a sword into a plowshare. Yeah, that sounds like fun. I want to add some etching to mine, and I'm going to put a little silver gilding on the handle for my plowshare. I get a Valentine plowshare and send it to my girlfriend. I'm just saying, do you think that's some ritual people are going to actually go through? Or is it just a metaphor for making peace, doing productive things instead of destructive things? Instead of forging weapons of war, forging weapons of peace. And so also this, instead of farming all this stuff, it's going to be a lot of grazing and a lot of people just avoiding it. And here's the thing, in spite of peace, people may still be afraid. After Jesus comes and the world is set right, like I said, the time of the people who survive and live into that time, at first will be somewhat uncertain of what's happening and going on. And just because you have the kingdom of God doesn't mean that everyone is going to 100% of the time appreciate how secure and safe it really is. Meaning, you could be totally secure and safe, but be afraid. And you've experienced this if you've ever heard a bump in the night and explored your house looking for an intruder. You may totally be safe, but you feel afraid or a little nervous. I don't want to offend anyone by telling them they're afraid when they're not. Like some people, you say, don't worry, and they're like, I'm not worrying, and they freak out. I have family members like that. They're just certain words, they don't like them. And so much for going. I'm not going to start a new chapter because it'll go 10 minutes over. So we've wrapped up that chapter. I think that's good. Where sheep run, but see how they in their translation, they'll become places where cattle are turned loose and where sheep run. It shall be for the sending of oxen. So again, they add some words, become places where it's like to create the right suggestion. They give the sentence a more definite direction, and this is what they do in a lot of their translation. They give. There are passages that are kind of obscure and a little bit like it could go either way sometimes. This isn't one of those passages. But there's some passages where it's like, and what they do is they often just make a decision arbitrarily and go for a particular meaning. And you lose the possibility of it having more than one meaning because you wouldn't know that because the obscurity and the ambiguity of the translation or of the word is removed when they make a specific decision to push it in a different direction. That would be my biggest criticism of translations like the NIV, is that they are not word for word translations, and they're certainly not thought for thought. I know that's what they're going for. I would not call it a thought for thought translation, but a thought to thought translation, meaning that they are telling us what they think the other people were thinking. I mean, the translators in the NIV are telling us what they think Isaiah was thinking when he wrote this. They are not saying we are translating this thought for thought. They say that, but that's nonsense. You can't translate things thought for thought because you don't have an avenue into anybody's mind. And so that's nonsense. And when people say they're doing a thought for thought translation, you mean it's a thought to thought translation, because it's not, in the first part, it's that's nonsense. I mean, I'm just being kind of silly, because thought for thought, thought to thought, there's really no difference. I mean, it's just I'm making the distinction. I'm saying there's a difference, because what I mean is I want to point out the fact that there are different ways you can address trying to figure out what someone thinks, but I happen to know it's one of the trickiest things human beings can undertake. You can't just figure out what people think. It's like getting into their brain, reading their minds. It's not reading their minds, but like someone writes something. Like I write something in English, right? English writers and readers have trouble figuring out what I mean. You know what I mean? You ever write an email and have someone misunderstand? You ever write a text and had it misunderstood? So yeah, I don't want translators to be telling me what they think they meant by it and changing the words so that in English it sounds more like what they think they meant. I don't like that. So that's why I don't like the NIV. I don't hate it. I don't think it's actually Satan's translation. I think the scholars did a good job, and I think that mostly a good job translating. And I think even their attempts to go thought for thought on us were pretty good. But I just don't agree with the concept, because I like to be able to tell people about, now, see, this passage is tricky. But instead, it becomes like, well, no, it's just about things going out and eating, and there's no trick to it at all. Well, I differ significantly on that. So, we'll continue in chapter 8 tomorrow. What is chapter 8? Chapter 8's, I don't have it open. I have only up to chapter 7. I'll have to add chapter 8 to my text. Oh, chapter 8 is beginning that one. I combined chapter 8 and 9 into one song. What is this? There shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse. Is that what this one is? No, wait. So we've had the promise. Why can't I find... I'm just clicking around. I got dumped. Tell me, what is chapter? I'm just curious. Mahar Shalal Hashbaz. Mahar Shalal Hashbaz. Remember I said the other day Isaiah had an interesting way of naming his kids, and they were all named prophetically? I remember after watching this, I told my wife earlier, I'm like, if we have a girl, we should call her Famine. That'd be a girl's name. I was like, I thought we should name our kids Famine and Woe, but I was like, those sound like girls' names. Like Flo and Woe. But we didn't do that, and she probably wouldn't like it. I'd probably have to back down on that one because it would grieve my wife too much. I never make your wife do anything that grieves her too much. You got to back off, guys. Don't make them name their babies awful names. And girls, don't make your guys, don't make your husbands suffer by giving your kids, especially their boys, don't give them sissy names. All right. Thanks for joining me in this study. We'll start again. We'll pick it up again tomorrow, chapter 8. We'll learn about Isaiah's son, Mahar Shalal Hashbaz, and what that all means. All right. Oh, since we're doing chapter 7, I have too many songs for chapter 7, so let's listen instead to this one. I don't know why I'm having trouble getting it. There we go.
And it shall come to pass in